McCuistion, for over 28 years talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers, supporters of the Foundation for Responsible Television, the Hatton W. Sumner's Foundation, helping to educate the public about the fundamental principles of their democracy and thus be in a position to help formulate public policy. The University of Texas at Dallas, creating the future.
Well, hello, I'm Dennis McCuistion, and today's subject is Russia, something that is on our mind more often than we'd probably like. And Jim, why don't you go ahead and put this in a little bit of perspective to start with, and then introduce our wonderful guest.
Well, I will, and it's certainly a long list of things that aren't really going so well between the U.S. and Russia relationship. I mean, we have hacking of our corporations and government. We have influence in presidential elections. We have an opposition leader that was poisoned. So I am really glad that we have with us Angela Stent. Former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, Michael McFaul, has said and described the relationship as what he says is a hot piece. I think it's sizzling. And Angela Stent, I guess it was about a year ago, wrote for Brookings that the U.S. relationship with Russia is today the worst that it has ever been since 1985. And I suspect we'll hear that it hasn't improved very much. Dr. Stent is the director of Georgetown University Center for Eurasian and Russian and East European Studies at Georgetown University. And she wrote a book that came out, I guess, about 18 months ago. The title was Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. And so welcome, Dr. Stent. Always a pleasure to see you.
Thank you for having me on your show.
So I think we'll start with that Brookings report, which you wrote a year ago. Would the title still be the same?
So I actually think that relations are worse now than they were a year ago. And I wouldn't say it's a hot piece. I would say we're entering an ice age. And I say that partly because the Russians decreed a couple of weeks ago that, for instance, we could have no Russians working at our embassy in Moscow. And so we are unable now to function. Spaso House, where the American ambassador has lived for decades, a beautiful house, has been shuttered because of all of this. And it's almost impossible to function just, as the embassy, the diplomacy to function. And this is really bad. Hopefully we can get out of this, but I see things spiraling down at the moment.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned that about the embassy, because I just looked earlier today at the embassy site, and a note from the embassy said, "We want to let all Russian citizens know that we're unable to process your visas at this point because of the actions of your government. We hope your government will reconsider so that we can again offer full consular services." So I suspect the Russian embassy is probably saying somewhat the same thing in our country as well.
But there's a difference, right? The Russians don't employ Americans. So
Absolutely.
If the Russian embassy in the United States does not employ Americans, and so in fact, if you really want, you can get visas, although you can't at the moment because of COVID. The difference is that we in the US, we employ foreign nationals around the world, not only in Russia.
Surprising that we would employ Russian nationals in our embassy.
They're tremendously helpful, really, in terms of the consular stuff, interviewing Russians who want visas. They have the language skills, and we've done that for decades. And, the people that I know who've worked at the embassy, they're tremendously loyal. A couple of years ago, I did a speaking tour, and I spoke at Spaso House in the embassy. And for instance, those foreign Russian nationals, they interpreted my speech. They took me around to interviews and things like that. So they've been very helpful. And it's also very sad for them, because now that they can't work at the US embassy, you have to wonder who's going to employ them, since Russia has now designated the United States as an unfriendly country.
Well, Angela, the interesting part of your analysis to some people is that you talk about the relationship between 1985 and now. Putin didn't sort of come on the scene as the head of it until 1999. So what happened from 85 to 99 that got us up to Putin?
Well, so of course, Mikhail Gorbachev was selected to be the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. And we'd come from a period of one very old and sick man after another, three of them in 3 years, being head of the Communist Party. And suddenly this young man, 52 or 53 years old, comes in, and he gradually really opened up the system. He realized that system couldn't work. And so if you look at the late Gorbachev period, something like 1988 to 1991, it really was a flourishing of freer expression. They had multiple party elections. There was really an opening up of society, and a Soviet leader who really wanted to have a good relationship with the United States, which he did develop, first with President Reagan and then with President George H.W. Bush. Then, of course, the Soviet Union collapsed. Boris Yeltsin became the president, and he also opened up society. He decommunized the country. But after about 1994, 95, he himself was sick. There was a greater opposition to him. And so by the time Putin came in 1999, when he became prime minister, Russia had suffered an economic crash in 1998. People had lost their savings. And from Putin's point of view, this was a great humiliation for Russia in the 1990s, that it had to follow an agenda that the United States had set, and it didn't have, if you like, any agency. So he came in determined to restore Russia as a great power, to restore a strong centralized state, and to really restore a strong leader.
And restoring that power, that's really given him some popularity, hasn't it?
It has. He was very lucky because when he became president in 2000, for the first 8 years of his time in office, oil prices were rising. Now, don't forget, the vast majority of the Russian budget earnings comes from the sale of oil and gas. And so when oil prices rose steadily, Russia was growing at 7% per year, unlike what happened in the 1990s. People's standard of living rose, people felt much more confident, and he was popular because he seemed to be delivering to them a better standard of living. Then, of course, the crash came in 2008, and things began to go downhill. And I would say since then, economically, it's been much more of a challenge. But he does retain his popularity, particularly in the provincial areas.
I'm glad you brought up the economy, because up until relatively recently, I always felt that one of our key advantages is that the Russian economy was not very strong and so dependent on commodities. And yet they've really done a fairly good job of building up their foreign reserves and protecting themselves against sanctions. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. So Putin, from the beginning, pursued a very sound macroeconomic policy. He didn't want to fritter away oil and gas reserves when prices were so high. And Russia now has, foreign currency reserves. I think it's $500 billion. So despite all the economic problems caused by COVID around the world, Russia has actually come through even the pandemic better than many people thought it would. Last year, people were predicting a 10% fall in growth. Well, it was a 3% fall in GDP. And this year, I think they are predicting that the Russian economy will grow. So even though this is an undiversified economy, it's still overly dependent on oil and gas revenues. It's doing better than people predict. And so I think one has to be very cautious about saying that the Russian economy is a basket case, because that's really not accurate.
Well, that's a good point, too. And we had on our program about 12 years ago, Angela, a guy named Herb Meyer, at the time in the early 80s, was involved in the Reagan administration in the economic side. And unlike some of the other agencies, CIA particularly, who thought that the Russian economy was much stronger than it was, they did their analysis and figured out the Russian economy was, in fact, on its knees. Now, hopefully, Russia is, let's say, more transparent now about where they are. But last I checked, some of these authoritarian groups have a tendency to lie about what they have, if you know what I mean, especially with China. But here's what he said about who Putin was. So if we're ready, let's play that clip.
Is Putin Stalin with a human face?
Is he Stalin with a human face?
Yes.
Probably worse, yeah. Like everybody else, we hoped he was, a bit of a thug, but maybe a modern thug, and he's looking like a total creep. He is driving Russia into the same ditch the communists drove it into back in the 20th century.
So, Angela, you heard what Herb Meyer had to say about Putin's character or lack of it. What are your comments about it?
So Putin, we know, had a hard-scrabble childhood. He was born just, 1952, not long after the end of the war. And Leningrad, where he was born, had gone through a 1,000-day siege by the Nazis. 1 million people had died. So his family was poor. They lived in one of these communal apartments. He was bullied as a child, et cetera, et cetera. So he came through that. And the way that he actually arose and managed to get out of these circumstances was by becoming a judo champion, which I think is important to remember. And I have in my book, Putin's World, an article from the Leningrad Evening News talking about, from 1972, talking about this new judo champion and saying this man will go far. Well, he did go far, but not as a judo champion, although he still practices it. So, and then, of course, he joined the KGB. He was a KGB case officer in East Germany for 5 years. And so again, he developed those skills of kind of psyching people out, of ingratiating himself with people to get information from them. And so that, I think, plus the judo skills, I think prepared him very well to read people's minds and to take advantage of opportunities presented to him by, let's say, the West when it wasn't looking, when it wasn't focused. So he understands how to read people's weaknesses. And he certainly brought those skills as a leader there, which is why, in a way, it's remarkable that Russia, with all of its, economic challenges, demographic challenges that we haven't talked about yet, has managed to restore itself as a world player. It has a GDP the size of that of Italy. It has crumbling infrastructure. It has this declining population. It has the over dependence on oil and gas revenues, and yet it's really strutting across the world stage. And that's largely because, Putin put his mind to it and managed to accomplish it.
Well, as some people have said, he's playing an extremely weak card, a weak hand very well. When you look back at the height of the Cold War, it seemed to me that it was ideological and you were really having capitalism versus communism and socialism. And the two superpowers were seeking to gain influence around the world, dividing up Africa and so forth. But now, what is Putin's end game? What is he trying to accomplish? Is it simply to reassert Russian power and prestige, or more something else?
Well, I think it's to make sure that Russia has rejoined the global board of directors, that Russia is consulted on all important international matters. What he really wants to do is to get the outside world to treat Russia as if it were the Soviet Union. That is, to respect it, accept its interests as being legitimate, and also to fear it. I think another major goal is to get the West to accept that Russia has a right to a sphere of influence in the post-Soviet space. So Putin's definition of Russia's security perimeter is not the borders of the Russian Federation. It's the borders of the post-Soviet space. He's not trying to restore the Soviet Union, but and that's why Ukraine takes on this kind of existential importance for him. But he wants to make sure that none of his neighbors, particularly in the West, join Western structures, NATO or the European Union. And in essence, the West recognizes that Russia has a right to the sphere.
Well, you touched on something else very important there when you talked about the sphere of influence there. And let's talk about Ukraine and, in fact, some of the other countries, because one of the things that you write about, of course, is that some of these countries, particularly in the Baltic area, have joined NATO. We just did a program recently on NATO. So give us some sense of how that particular dynamic affects Putin and how he governs.
Well, I mean, there's a kind of a myth circulating around that has been for a long time that somehow the West or Secretary of State James Baker promised Gorbachev that NATO would never enlarge. That's not true. We never made promises like that. And Gorbachev himself has said that. And when the Baltic states joined NATO in 2004, they, of course, had been part of the Soviet Union, although only incorporated by force in 1940. Putin didn't complain very much. I mean, the Russians weren't thrilled. But now the narrative has changed, and The narrative that you can hear from Putin and any other high-level officials is that NATO is a threat to Russia, that we're trying to overthrow Russia. But clearly, he is determined that no other country that used to be in the Soviet Union should join NATO.
So we talked about, or you talked about the board of directors. Another country that really wants a primary seat at the board table is China. And Russia and China have been, it seems, working together and signing agreements much more than in the past.
Yes, so in 2014 is the key year here. Russia annexed Crimea. The United States, the European Union imposed sanctions on Russia and tried to isolate Russia. And so Russia turned to China. Russia and China had been negotiating a natural gas deal for years, and the Russians hadn't wanted to pay the price that the Chinese, to accept the price that the Chinese wanted to pay, but they didn't have much leverage in 2014. So they signed a $400 billion gas deal with China. And since then, the relationship has gotten much closer. Both countries feel grievances against the West. They feel that the West has neglected their interests. They're both authoritarian leaders. They support each other. They never criticize each other for what they do domestically. But you see now greater military coordination, joint military exercises. The Russians are working with Huawei on the 5G issues. And so in a number of different areas, you see closer Russian-Chinese cooperation, and they're both committed to the so-called post-West international order, although I think they have rather different ideas of what that means. And the latest thing they're trying to do is to move away from trading in dollars, the de-dollarization of their relationship. And even they're talking about the possibility of creating an alternative to the SWIFT international payment system. They may well not be able to do that, but I see this as a strategic partnership that is growing closer.
So what should our response be?
Yeah, I think we should not do things that drive them closer together. I think in the Trump administration, the combination of a trade war with China and these rafts of sanctions on Russia drove the two countries together. So I think the US has to think about policies that we implement and not do it in such a way that the two countries, that they're each other's only alternatives. That's not an easy thing to do, but I think that should be something that the Biden administration focuses on.
You know, that's a great point, Angela, that you make there. You know, China has obviously the thing with Russia, both authoritarian regimes. They also have one other thing in common, which is extremely difficult, especially for Russia, maybe more than China right now, but and that is the demographic issue. Herb Meyer talked about that. And I think he said at that time that Putin had set September 12th every year as the day of creation, where people were supposed to make babies on September the 12th. Give us some sense of the demographic issues that they're facing in Russia.
So the population has been declining in Russia actually steadily since the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's not uniform. So the Slavic population is not reproducing itself. Among the Muslim population, of which there are about 22 million now, they are reproducing themselves at high rates. And so as we go on in this century, you're going to have proportionately fewer Slavs in the general mix of the population. That's one thing. Secondly, the thing about Russia that's so worrying for the Russians is it's the mortality rate for young men between 18 and 30. Those mortality rates are similar to those in sub-Saharan Africa or Haiti. They're not like the mortality rates for young men in a developed country. And that's a result, I think, of a number of factors, unhealthy lifestyles and things like that. So they have to, and of course that has major implications for the Russian military and for the labor force. So increasingly, they do use migrant labor from Central Asia, and they're letting some of those migrants also join the armed forces now. So immigration for them is really a key going forward. But Putin just now recently made another major speech to the Federal Assembly, where again he encouraged people to have children. But the outlook is not good demographically.
One of the things that has puzzled me over the last few months is that Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader who was poisoned and was able to go to Germany and recovered and came back to Moscow and now has been put in a pretty draconian prison. Why do you think he came back? Didn't he know that this was going to happen? And do you think he would be able to become a martyr?
You know, he looks at the other opposition leaders like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who of course was in jail for 10 years in Russia, all of whom have left Russia. And he looks at them and he realizes, even though they try and operate from abroad and support the opposition in Russia, they've really lost most of their clout. So I think he wanted to show his followers, I'm not going to live in exile, you know, a cushy life in Germany or wherever. I'm going to come back and I'm going to fight for what I believe in. And he knew he was going to be arrested. And of course he was. And as we know, he's then went on a hunger strike. Now, of course, he's off the hunger strike, and his lawyers visited him yesterday. I was just reading a report, and they report that he's doing as well as he can, given the circumstances.
Is his movement dead?
It's not dead yet. Most of the leaders are now outside the country, but they've had to close down all the branches in Russia because the movement has been declared an extremist organization. So I think it's going to be very difficult for it to function going forward.
Is there any credible opposition group?
There really isn't. I mean, Navalny was the most popular leader, but again, a poll came out today from the independent organization Levada, and only 18% of the population supported the protests in favor of Navalny. So there really isn't anyone else. What the Kremlin has succeeded in doing is really neutralizing any kind of opposition and driving most of the opposition figures into exile. The big difference between Putin's Russia and the Soviet Union is you can leave if you don't like it. And that's the safety valve for Putin too.
Well, the issue of Russia's size is a big problem as well. Talk about the time zone issue, and also the concern that we have, I think, in terms of the gang or basically mafia, oligarchy, et cetera. How does that affect Putin's power base, and how do you actually govern something that covers 11 time zones?
Well, it's very difficult to cover 11 time zones, and the Tsars found it difficult, and so did the Soviets. And so you try and centralize everything. Under Yeltsin, they decentralized, and it was chaotic. So you try and rule in a central way, and you're trying to exercise control, but that doesn't always work. I would say in Siberia, there is a sort of latent independence movement, and some of the governors there are more difficult to deal with from the Kremlin's point of view. As you said, I mean, Russia is essentially a kleptocracy, or as one of my Russian colleagues likes to say, it's run by the people who own it. And the problem for these people is, as in all authoritarian systems, how do you leave? It's very interesting. Mr. Gorbachev gave an interview recently where he said, I've been able to, leave power and live quietly and comfortably because I didn't steal anything. And that was a fairly pointed interview. And so you have a group of people in power now who fear that if they are out of power, they may go to jail, someone may take their assets. And that's the conundrum for these people. And it's, I think, the conundrum why Putin has now had the constitution changed so that he can remain in office until 2036, because they just don't know how to leave power. And there has never been in Russian history an organized succession possibility. So I think this is the space we have to watch.
One of the most challenging challenges for the Biden administration is the relationship between certain European countries and Russia, where the interests are not the same. And you certainly see that with Germany and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. What do you think will be the outcome of that? And how does the U.S. manage these divergent views?
Well, I think the U.S. has to be very careful when it deals with a country like Germany and the sanctions on Nord Stream. What we're essentially doing is sanctioning our ally, not sanctioning Russia. And we've done this before, and it never works out. We did it under Reagan, and in fact, under John Kennedy, too, trying to prevent the construction of pipelines. So I think the Nord Stream pipeline will be built. It's 90% completed. I think that the best that the Biden administration can do, and I think that's what it's doing now, is to try and work out an agreement with Germany to make sure that Ukraine is protected. The Ukrainians are worried that with Nord Stream, they will lose more of the revenues from the transit of Russian gas through Ukraine. Now, there's another whole question about whether, in fact, it's healthy for a country like Ukraine that's trying to be independent to be so dependent on gas revenues from Russia. They'd probably be better off without that dependence, but at the moment they are. So I think you try and work out an arrangement with the Germans, and I think this is what the Biden administration is trying to do. But of course, the Congress itself, has all these sanctions already. It's got more sanctions, in the pipeline, so to speak. And we know that, for instance, Senators Ted Cruz and Jeanne Shaheen were holding up the confirmation votes on some of the Biden administration officials because they want more sanctions on Nord Stream.
We just have a minute or so left, Angela. And, Russia is supporting all kinds of things we don't like in Syria, Venezuela, Iran, Afghanistan, et cetera. Give us a sense of what you think the Biden administration might be able to do to solve some of the problems connected to that.
So I think it's a real challenge. I think that one thing that the Biden administration will focus on is sort of more arms control and then these strategic stability talks, getting together with the Russians and saying, how can we lower the temperature here and lessen the possibility of some, unforeseen clash. I think that's going to be a very important point of discussion. There are other areas where we may be able to work with the Russians. The climate issues are one. Putin has now discovered climate change, and we know that John Kerry has already met with different Russian counterparts on this. I think there has to be some kind of conversation on cyber. You mentioned the pipeline. We had the solar winds hack last year. I think those are very difficult issues, but the Russians at least want to sit down and discuss cyber rules of the road. So I don't know whether the Biden administration will be willing to do that.
I hope the Biden administration will call you because I like your ideas. Thank you for joining us, Jim. Always great to have you here. And for you watching this program, Russia will continue to be an issue. We give you different perspectives on it, as you've heard here. We always talk about things that matter. So join us on McQuistionTV.com and on social media. And thank you again for tuning in.
For more information, call 214-750-5157 or email NikkiN@NikkiMcQuistion.com. Visit our website at www.McQuistionTV.com. You can also follow us on Twitter at www.twitter.com/McQuistionTV or download McQuistion TV video podcast on iTunes.